Thank you for joining us for the Secure Connections podcast, brought to you by IoTSSA, the Internet of Things Security Services Association. As always, I'm your host, Brian Sherman, Content Director for IoTSSA, and joining me for today's episode is Chris Johnson from PinPoint Solutions. As a noted expert in HIPAA and the general compliance field and security in general, Chris has worked with a number of organizations in the channel over the years. He served as one of the first CompTIA community leaders and helped mold an untold number of industry initiatives and training programs. He also spent 20 years building an MSP and provides IT and security services to SME and mid-market clients. Currently, he is focused on helping channel companies improve the security services delivery model. Chris, welcome to the Secure Connections podcast.
Hey, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you today. Let's start off with a get-to-know-you question. How did you get your start in the IT industry?
That is a very loaded question. I think anybody that's in the IT industry probably has a plethora of, that wasn't the story that got me started. Because I think IT is one of those things where I don't want to say you fall into it, but very few of us intentionally went to school to pick IT as our career path. Right. For me, I had come from IT. I don't want to say it was an IT degree, but I got an information systems degree. So out of college, I was like, I need to do something that is useful because I've spent all this money on college. And I ended up having the opportunity to volunteer at my wife's school. And then within roughly 6 months of that, I got sucked into, because of my degree, a startup company took a chance on me and hired me as their systems administrator. What that meant was I had a Microsoft toll-free number with a number of useful tickets to call into support on. And that kind of launched my career as I know it today in the space of IT.
Back in the day when Microsoft actually responded to you, huh? That's a great thought.
Back in the day where not only did they respond, but those incidents were like gold because you paid a flat fee of, I think it was like $250. And until that problem was solved, they were yours.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the great era. So I wish we still had that. But
right.
Awesome. So tell me about PinPoint Solutions and your emphasis on security. What are you guys doing over there?
So PinPoint Solutions, the starting of the launch of PinPoint was really built around the idea that no one wants to consult under their name. It's just kind of bad form with taxes and everything else that goes with it. And so two guys that I had worked with almost 20 years ago had hit me up and said, Chris, we really need to get back together and start doing some consulting, mid-market enterprise space. And I said, I'm game for consulting, but I would also like to, for lack of a better word, give back, or the opportunity to give back to my peers, which was what I consider as the channel, or a lot of the MSPs that participate in channel activities, with the things that are, I think, really important to the success long-term as we go into a world. I think that more and more our kids growing up in this digital age aren't going to know anything different, and security is probably not the primary focus. And I said, you can do whatever you want to do. We just want to know that you're participating with us on enterprise consulting engagements. And so that launched PinPoint, and we are now a year and a half into its sort of inaugural voyage. And I count half a dozen or so clients in the MSP space as my clients to focus on security.
Awesome. Well, I mentioned earlier, too, that you were very involved in CompTIA. I think that's probably where we first met. I hate to say it's probably been a decade or close to it, where they built out the healthcare IT community, and you were actively involved in that. And kind of my go-to, I did a lot of writing in that space, my go-to for HIPAA and healthcare industry and security in general. But what kind of value do you get back from being involved in those kind of MSP-focused programs? You're still involved, I think, in CompTIA and many other associations that way, but why do you get involved in doing so many outward-facing activities?
So that's a question that I've pondered quite a bit, because when I first got involved in CompTIA and some of the other initiatives, it was really hard to be successful without having credibility and being considered an expert in your field. So when I was still running Untangled Solutions back in, I want to say it was like 2010, 2009, some of the communities then at CompTIA were relatively new. And one of the things that my business partner, Joshua Smith, and I at the time had said is, if we're going to do this thing in healthcare, we have to be the go-to experts. And so how do you establish that credibility? You know, one can say fake it till you make it, which is part of any successful business, I think, especially when you're starting out. And that was to get involved in the communities that would help grow our business. And of course, in this case, it was healthcare at the time. And so I happened to be in the right place at the right time where, you know, volunteers are not a commodity, right? Everybody needs volunteers in order to have nonprofits be successful. And I got plugged in right where I needed to be with the healthcare community. So I think at the end of the day, it was right place, right time. But in so doing, I was able to quickly accelerate our company's recognition with those that we were serving. And so I think any MSP, any IT, any business that wants to be successful, you got to get plugged in to sort of the trade organizations that are relevant to your business. And in so doing, finding, you know, others that you can surround yourself with to not have to fake it till you make it, but rely on those who are the experts until you become one yourself.
That makes perfect sense. And I know compliance, especially in the healthcare, the early advantage, I think, for the channel in healthcare was that security component of it. So compliance, all of it comes down to security and the processes behind it in one form or another. But now you're kind of focused more on general security, and I shouldn't say general, but broad, and addressing all of the specific issues in security. One of the things that you mentioned is you focus on cybersecurity maturity. Can you kind of go into that? I know we've been talking about 10 years of HIPAA and other things, but what does cybersecurity maturity mean to you?
So for me, I threw maturity onto the end of that as a result of, as an MSP, I think one of the things, particularly in the channel, is we have a tendency, and myself included, to chase the shiny object. And that could be in the form of the new appliance / firewall / you name it, it does something great and cool, makes my job easier. The latest RMM tool, the latest backup solution, anything that helps me build my portfolio and at the same time make how I capitalize my profitability, those sorts of things, without having to necessarily grow my overhead. And in this process, one of the things that we don't do a good job of is consider, okay, I'm going to put this backup solution, this firewall, you name it, into my client's environment. What am I doing in my own environment? And I've heard so many MSPs say, oh, well, it's not applicable to me. And I've heard the saying, you got to eat your own dog food. I don't know about you, but I'm not a big fan of eating what my dog eats. So I would liken it more to, you got to drink your own champagne. Hopefully I made a good batch. And I think that's really where this is at. So when I think about cybersecurity maturity, and while you can also do this with your clients, an MSP with their clients, for me, it's about focusing on what I didn't do when I was running my own MSP, and that was making sure that I was as secure and compliant as I possibly could, while at the same time looking at it through the lens of what are the risks I'm willing to take to grow my business, because that is often at conflict with security.
That makes perfect sense. I know we've at IoTSSA, it's been an ongoing discussion about the vulnerabilities that MSPs face themselves, because obviously they control the keys to the kingdom for many clients and networks. And by the way, I love the drink your own champagne, although I've utilized the other phrase quite a bit over the years.
Right.
But yeah, I think it just makes sense for MSPs. What are you seeing as far as some of the foundational principles that MSPs may not have practiced well in the past?
So for me, one of the easiest ones to tackle, and I know I was there before, is tied to, for example, if I sell Sonic Wall or FortiGate, maybe I sell 3 or 4 different products in my stack, that at least one of those products that are in my line card, if you will, I had better be using that. And when I hear MSPs say, oh, well, we all work from home. okay, well, what firewalls are you implementing at home that fall in line with the product stack that you're willing to put in your customers' environments? And that's where there's pause in many cases, because there's still that, quick argument of saying, well, I don't because. So that's an opportunity to have a deeper conversation, because I'm not articulating that what they're doing is wrong. It's that you need to be able to defend your stance with your customer as to why you're not using, in some cases, the products or services that you would sell, because maybe it isn't a fit. That kind of comes back to, as an organization, what are the risks that I'm willing to take on, because it doesn't make sense in every single case to drink your own champagne. And once you've sort of established that and you know where those boundaries are, those lines in the sand that you're not willing to cross on certain things, then I think you're launching from there into areas where it's like, well, we do these things and we expect the same thing from our clients.
So things like you mentioned the firewall, but utilizing VPN, awareness training, all of those type of things that might get pushback from a CEO of a client who is in the same situation. You need to be able to defend those by actually doing it yourself.
Right. And sometimes it's less about for lack of a better word, the Nike versus the Reebok type scenario. And it's more about the policies and procedures that fit in that space to say, yes, in my home office, because it doesn't make sense to put a $5,000 firewall at home for the 2 days a week that I work from home, but I have implemented the following policies and procedures so that when I am at home, I have to use the laptop on my firewall, or I'm using a VPN. I segment my network at home so that I'm not on the same network my kids are playing Fortnite on.
That makes perfect sense. So no shortcuts.
No shortcuts.
Gotcha. Well, you mentioned policies and procedures, and I know that's a foundation for many of the regulatory compliance requirements these days. How are you handling, or I should say, what type of support do you provide in that area?
Well, one, I think it's really about not reinventing the wheel. And we are notorious in the industry of using tools like Google and what's on the internet to help build out our portfolios of things. Like, I found a template for elevated permissions, for least privilege, whatever you want to call it, for the policy that I might need to execute. We go on the internet, we download one that looks close to what we think we need to do, and we start working off of that policy. Over the years, I have found that that's not a good idea. You want to have policy templates and policies that are really driven by either the regulatory compliance component that you're helping yourself or your client adhere to, or they're written purely from an IT perspective in order to, not leave anything out. I think that the area that I provide assistance in is helping both MSPs and MSPs customers determining, when you do have that boilerplate template, assuming you have one, is wading through the content in that policy that's relevant and being able to articulate on sections that are not articulating that. Because the last thing you want to do is just put NA on a policy or a section of a policy, then have an audit come through and they want an explanation, and your response is, well, it's not applicable to me.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So you're also doing, you're working very closely with MSPs on their own risk management?
Yes. Risk management is really a smaller component, but it factors into everything else I think that we've been talking about. I know you've talked about it a little bit with your own organization. It's, what are our business goals, right? What's driving our organization forward? And I think that a lot of clients that we face as MSPs are going to be clients that say, I've got to check these boxes in order to satisfy the following: HIPAA compliance, NIST 171 compliance. Help me check these boxes. And in many cases, you're not being brought in at the CEO level or decision maker level, even if that's the role that they play in their organization, particularly the smaller entities. They really want you to come in because you're their IT service provider and remediate areas by just checking the boxes, right? So, I need intrusion detection. It's like, no problem. I've got you covered. We've changed the Sonic Wall subscription that you have, and we've checked the box for IDS. You're good to go. those are not necessarily in line with what they really need to do from a risk management standpoint, because it may be counterproductive for their organization to add IDS. And this might be a bad example in justifying what to secure and not secure, but the point is that as I look at my organization and I meet with those that are the decision makers for my company, I need to be able to say, is where I'm going with my business, what are the risks that I'm willing to take to say to be the best in my trade, the best in my vertical? Do I want to be number one? Do I want to be number two? And what does that look like? What risks am I willing to take? And then from the top down approach it, these security, these compliance components, I'm doing this for my business. And in so doing, I'm also going to now check some boxes along the way to satisfy these regulatory requirements instead of satisfying regulatory requirements just to do it.
That's what I was going to ask is, do you find that MSPs in general spend a lot more time talking about the compliance aspect and making sure that's taken care of than the overall security of the organization, which might not just be limited to HIPAA compliance or NIST or any of the different compliance measures?
I think it's more in line with, we believe in security. We know security is a critical part of being an MSP and what we provide our clients, but I think it often gets clouded by compliance because compliance is easier to talk about because the script's already written.
Sure.
Clients don't understand language like I have to have this firewall versus that firewall, stateful inspection, versus dynamic, or some of the other configurations, or I want it all on one appliance, but maybe I need 2 or 3 appliances. Going back to CompTIA, I remember extensive conversations that Mike Simmel and I had around security as a community really doesn't make sense because all of the communities need security in them. And while we're not articulating that the security community should just go away, that was not it at all. It was that the energy that we spend on this, knowing that you could multiply that out times all of the communities that need to be talking about security. And I think that's where it gets murky and no one wants to talk about it because it's not easy anymore when it's not focused or targeted around things that are tangible.
Right. Well, does that get even more clouded, the SMB? Because I know you're also up against budgetary limits and going in to talk to a smaller company about dark web and awareness training and things like that they may be thinking, oh, those are not anything that would affect me. Is how does the size of the organization play into providing comprehensive security?
So I'll deny saying this, even though we are recording this. It's not the size of the entity. It's not the, for lack of a better word, I think budgets and the size of the organization have absolutely nothing to do with what needs to be secured versus not. And I think we're too quick to say, well, I am so small in this, vast Ethernet or internet world of espionage and cybersecurity that no one's looking for me. And the reality is that that's probably true. The problem is the person that's looking for the low-hanging fruit is not specifically targeting small versus big. They stumble upon, a firewall or they go to an IP address that has the following open ports and they follow the trail. And if it happens to be a big organization or a small organization, that's not why they're following the trail. Once they figure out maybe what's behind it, they may put more resources against it because maybe it is bigger. But the reality is that's not the target. And going back to healthcare, when we talk about large entities versus small entities, healthcare is broken down by the provider. So if, say, bad things happen, it's not going to be a large organization that's fighting to save. It's going to be every single provider, trying to hold hands and work together, when the reality is each one of them has their own, crux to bear.
That's an excellent point. I mean, it's getting easier to find stories on and articles on ransomware and things. I think this week's was Jackson County, Georgia. I think what did they end up spending? $400,000. They paid off ransomware plus whatever the other costs were to restore. We see those regularly, the larger ones, but you don't see the mom and pop that went out of business because they got hacked and can't get their data or or compromised. Um, I should say, fortunately, we don't see those stories, but we know they're happening. They're just not being reported.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that we're not.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that's really interesting and sad, scary, whatever you want to call it, is the organizations that don't pay a ransom, because obviously ransom's newsworthy. So I worked with a client of mine. It's been about a year now. They got hit with ransomware. The ransom fee was about $10,000. That's what they wanted, and it kept climbing. I think at one point it was close to $250,000 before they realized that they weren't going to get $250,000. So it started to walk back down, and then the ultimatum was, if you pay in, and I can't remember the cryptocurrency that they wanted, but it was very difficult to get your hands on. So it's a 48-hour conversion period. So the guys on the ransom side, they were very nice to work with. In fact, they were better than a lot of the customer service groups within our own MSP space today. In fact, they even said things like, if you type all in caps, we consider that to be yelling, and that will cease all negotiation. And ultimately, the client didn't pay the ransom. So costs to the organization with insurance, I think they forked out close to $170,000 to get themselves back online.
Wow.
And it took 90 days to get all systems back to 100%. So that's a much bigger issue than I've had my data decrypted, right? Like, those are the other things that factor into this, that even if I pay the ransom, what are the other costs that are going to impact my business because of lack of planning, as if this was any normal disaster that could happen to anybody?
Now back that scenario up that happened to the MSP, which we've heard a few cases of that happening even, over the last 6 months. I can't imagine how that affects your business.
I don't know that an MSP would very easily come back from that unless they were able to prove that they had truly protected all client data and access to all client data.
Right. That could be a very serious issue, which I don't think everybody thinks about the implications. We talk, drinking your own champagne it's extremely crucial to follow those policies and processes and secure themselves as much as possible. We know the inevitable can still happen, but if they're doing everything and minimizing those risks, it's really business saving.
Well, think about insurance. It's really smart that, we in the MSP space, we get our, liability coverage and all that, so that when we're working with a client, if we cause harm or damage to our client's environment, we're protected. We can pay those damages. But in many cases, the coverages that we have, if we are the ones that are attacked or have the data destroyed, we're not covered with those same plans.
Yeah, we could probably do an entire podcast, I think, on cybersecurity.
I'm sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we have done a couple, but I would love to do it from someone on the MSP side too that has experience working with those. But the following the best practices is obviously the key part. What did you say are the vulnerabilities? You're working with MSPs, working with helping them with their clients. What are you finding are the biggest vulnerabilities these days in the internet age?
The vulnerabilities to an MSP or to their clients?
Well, we can actually talk about both.
I think the vulnerabilities are the unknowns. I think that we do a really good job of focusing on the things that are tangible, but it's very difficult to, plan for the unforeseen. If you live in an area that's not prone to flooding, you may not have a lot in place that would protect from that. And I think that in the cyberspace, everything is on the table, and we forget that sometimes. So I think it's just the due diligence of, as you step through any sort of security strategy, whether it's for your own organization or your clients, is to not leave anything out. It's one thing to have a client say, not in my budget, let's forecast that out a year. Obviously, there's some risk there because something bad could happen during that window. But the reality is, if you put a plan in place, the worst case scenarios are unlikely to directly impact everybody involved because you've done some things to prevent the worst case scenario.
Right. As long as you've documented and looked at the various risks, I mean, at some point you could spend and spend and spend and still not be totally protected. There has to be a limit at some point.
Correct.
Great. So obviously we're running low. A lot of great information, Chris, today. Any final comments before we end today's show? What suggestions would you have for MSPs moving forward to minimize their vulnerabilities?
I think the biggest thing for MSPs to minimize their vulnerabilities is to just make sure that you've got everything documented. Policies and procedures are easy to focus on when it's your client, but when we don't have those things documented internally, audits, bad situations have a tendency to haunt us because we didn't have the paperwork in order to supply it when we were asked for it.
Are there particular templates? I know you mentioned before that you can find anything on the internet, but are there any recommendations you have for finding templates for these documentation?
Sure. I always say, the CIS top 20 questions is a good place to start to build some policies around that. They kind of articulate 14 or so categories for, privileged access, business continuity, disaster recovery type stuff, getting into what does your backup plan look like, media disposal, those types of things. I think it's really important that, we get those things documented. MSPs are notorious for we have a good process and then it's not written down. And vendors like, IT Glue and Passportal and some of these others that have come up or new business models are tied directly to that. And they're a stepping stone, I think, to good policy and procedure.
That's a good point. And I think if you look at the CompTIA Security Trust Mark Plus 2 has a pretty good program to go through that requires a lot of documentation on what MSPs are doing internally, as well as what they're doing for their clients. I could see that utilized as well.
There's also the risk assessment that CompTIA has, the security sort of posture. I think that's a good one. We're quick to do it with our clients. I started focusing on doing that before I sold my MSP, and I found my own sort of gaps. I couldn't articulate answers to questions that I should have known off the top of my head, and I didn't. So that's another good resource to use.
So it's a good exercise to
absolutely
actually go through these exercises on a regular basis.
I think exercise is very healthy.
Yeah, even security-wise.
Even security-wise.
Great. So how can our listeners get in touch with you?
The best way to get in touch with me right now is to email me, chris@pinpointsolutions.com. For those of you that have my cell phone number, I'm not going to put it on the podcast because I might run out of room on my voicemail. But you guys know how to get a hold of me. Email's the best because oftentimes I'm already on the phone. But I'd love to hear from you and look forward to talking.
Well, we appreciate you taking your time to share your insight today, Chris. On behalf of IoTSSA, I'd like to extend a big thank you to Chris Johnson of PinPoint Solutions for joining us today. And I encourage our listeners to check out all the great channel-exclusive cybersecurity content on the association's website. That's IoTSSA.com. Have a safe and secure day, and be sure to stay tuned for our next Secure Connection.